What's going on, everybody? It's Chris here from the Commander Arsenal, and today we are doing a deck tech for Yidris, Maelstrom Wielder. So Yidris is a 4-drop, 5/4 legendary creature with trample, whose effect gives us Cascade for every spell that we cast from our hand each turn after it deals combat damage to a player. Yidris is just very good at generating value, so a lot of the creatures and spells that we're playing in this deck are just big value cards that are going to do something whenever they hit the battlefield. So let's start by going into our creatures. So our primary win condition with this deck is going to be our combo suite. So that's going to be Kiki Jiki, Splinter Twin, Pestermite, Deceiver Exarch, and Zealous Conscripts. The reason that we play the combo suite versus win an attrition war with this deck, which this deck can easily do, is we just want to kill everybody at the table at once. We don't want to deal with trading back and forth between people on the table because our creatures are very valuable to us. We have like you'll see, our suite is a lot of utility creatures, early game creatures, and a lot of clones too. But our big creatures are just the same kind of thing. They're very utility based, they do something whenever they hit the board. They're not necessarily going to win us the game though, so we want to have this combo just so that we have a set win condition that we can tutor up, we can birthing pod for, we can cord for later, that's just very easy and accessible for us. Let's get into our value cards, our big creatures that are really going to get us a lot of stuff from Yidris and just do a lot on their own. So our big creatures and value cards are going to be Grave Titan, Inferno Titan, Avenger of Zendikar, Woodfall Primus, Maelstrom Wielder, and Terrastodon. All of these creatures do something whenever they either come onto the board or attack, which is what we want in this kind of deck, because with the type of play groups that you're going to be playing this sort of hyper-competitive deck with, things aren't going to stick around that long. So let's just start from Grave Titan. Grave Titan just puts a lot of damage onto the board, and plus having Death Touch too, it allows us to block and kill any big threats that our opponents put on the table in front of us. Inferno Titan is just super versatile. We can shoot down Planeswalkers, we can just shoot players, we can shoot down tokens that they're making. It's just a super awesome card that if we're playing red, we should probably just be playing this just because of the value that it brings. Avenger of Zendikar, same thing as Grave Titan. It's going to bring us token generation, and if that thing isn't answered, those tokens are going to get really big because we have so much ramp and we have so many cards that let us cheat lands into play. So we're playing cards like Oracle and Veteran Explorer that are going to, in the late game, they're normally going to be kind of dead draws. They're not going to do much for us, but since we're playing Avenger, it can really sort of amplify their usefulness in the late game. Woodfall Primus is just an awesome 8-drop to have in the deck. It combos with things like Deadeye Navigator. It allows us to do things like Damnation and then still have a creature on the board that can deal with something. Maelstrom Wielder in these colors I think is an auto include. It's where Yidris gets its name from, and it's going to let us Cascade twice and give all of our creatures haste, which is going to make our big creatures even better because they're going to be the biggest threat on the board, and we want them to get at least one attack in, especially with things like Grave Titan and Inferno Titan. They're going to do stuff whenever they attack. Terrastodon is just awesome big creature that has some utility to it in the same way that Woodfall Primus has utility to it. And since it's generating tokens, we can do things like Cyclonic Rift all of our opponent's stuff back to their hand, and they'll just lose all of their creatures that they got off of Terrastodon. And a 9/9, it doesn't have much to it since it's not unblockable, it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have anything like that. But just because we have that removal on a stick that it brings and the ability to blow up lands, it can blow up enchantments, artifacts, all that kind of stuff. We can combo that with Deadeye Navigator, we can combo that with our clones later and just get as many Terrastodons as we can and just wipe somebody out of the game, so it's a lot of fun. So let's get started on our early game creatures. Our early game creatures are really going to want to ramp us and get us those resources that we're going to need to be able to cast those big creatures later on. So we have Coiling Oracle, Solemn Simulacrum, Wood Elves, Bloodbraid Elf, Oracle of Moldiah, and Veteran Explorer. Starting with the lowest cost, we'll go with Veteran Explorer. Veteran Explorer is just an awesome group hug card to have in a green EDH deck. Everybody wants to kill the Veteran Explorer, get some more lands, and the best part about this card is that your basic lands are going to come in untapped. So if somebody kills a Veteran Explorer on your turn with you attacking, you're going to have those resources in your second main phase to be able to cast something a little bit bigger that you wouldn't have had enough mana to otherwise do. Then we have Coiling Oracle. So Coiling Oracle is going to let us ramp a little bit more, but it's also going to give us a card in our hand if it's not a land. Then, of course, the classic Wood Elves. Wood Elves is going to let us get any forest from our library, including our shock lands, which we'll get into a little bit later. Then, for just more ramp, we have Solemn Simulacrum, which is pretty standard in most EDH decks. It's going to let us find a basic land and let us draw a card whenever it dies. And then for even more ramp, we're going to have Oracle of Moldiah. That's going to let us play an extra land, so it combos with our bounce land. We're playing one Simic Growth Chamber in the deck, and allow us to kind of filter the top of our library. Then for our last early game creature, we're going to do more cascading in this deck, because that's what this deck really does. We got one Bloodbraid Elf. So Bloodbraid Elf is going to let us get some cards like Demonic Tutor. It's going to get us cards like Rampant Growth, Farseek, even Heuristic Study, which is awesome in the early game because nobody has the mana to pay for you to draw an extra card. So you're just going to draw a shit ton of cards that way. It even lets us get something like a Sylvan Library, which is going to let us filter the top of our deck for whenever we actually drop Yidris to be able to cascade into exactly what we want. So our early game creatures are really just kind of setting us up for the late and mid games. So this deck plays a lot of utility creatures. So we are playing Glenalandra, Muldrifter, Green Warden of Marusa, Deadeye Navigator, Thassa, Eternal Witness, Reclamation Sage, Acidic Slime, Duplicant, Runescarred Demon, and Massacre Worm. So in the deck, we're not playing a whole ton of instants and sorceries. We really have a lot of creatures that are going to do the same thing for us that instants and sorceries normally would. So we have things like Glenalandra, which are going to be our counterspell on a stick. That's going to let us counter anything that's going to try and remove our board. It's going to let us counter anything that might be threatening our board, somebody else might be threatening lethal with it. And it's also so good because we're playing these 3 clones that I'll get into that's just going to allow us to continually have these constant threats on the board and kind of be able to control the game. This deck plays very mid-rangey and control-y. Even though it's not playing that many instant sorceries like I said, you really want to be able to kind of control what your opponents are doing. People are going to look at you on the table whenever you're playing this deck like, do you have the answer? Because 9 times out of 10 you will have some sort of answer because this deck has so much card draw. This deck has so many ways of generating resources for itself and getting stuff back and killing things on the board. There's not a time where you're not really going to have an answer to a certain threat. Muldrifter, self-explanatory, get us a 2/2 body with flying, or let us draw 2 cards whenever and just sacrifice it after that. Let us divination with it. Green Warden and Eternal Witness, I'm going to group those 2 together because they do the exact same thing. Green Warden, I feel like, is one of the most underrated cards in the format right now. Green Warden just does so much, man. Like, it has a big body. It's pretty high mana cost card, so you can do things like Birthing Pod into a Vendor of Zendikar and get more cards back from your graveyard and get a 7-drop onto the board, which is just so much value. And then Eternal Witness, everybody plays it. Thassa is one of the most recent inclusions in the deck. It combos so well with Yidris, and it allows us to not play cards like Whisper Silk Cloak, which a lot of the Yidris decks play, just so that they can have Shroud and be able to connect Yidris each turn. Thassa allows us to do that on a stick, and let us scry every turn. Reclamation Sage and Acidic Slime, I'm going to group those 2 together. They just do the same thing as our Woodfall Primuses and Terastodons. They just let us get things off the board. You can do things like pot a Coiling Oracle into a Reclamation Sage and just get a ton of value. And Acidic Slime, just more of that land destruction, baby. We're the same thing as Terastodon. Pair that with a Deadeye Navigator. We're going to go through and just start blowing people's lands up so that they can't really do anything and kind of lock people out. Duplicant is just amazing removal. I keep going back to this, you can pod into it, you can Quarter Calling into it, and that's why we're playing so many of these creatures, is because we play such versatile cards that let us tutor for our creatures and let us get to them in the best way possible. Duplicate's just good because it allows us to not have to rely so much on our instants and sorceries to remove things. We can just apply more pressure to the board but constantly be getting rid of threats. Massacre Worm is just more removal on a stick. It lets us get rid of tokens, it lets us get rid of smaller threats on the board that threaten to block our Yidris, it lets us get rid of things that might block our Terastodon, all that kind of stuff. We want to get rid of those chump blockers with Massacre Worm. Then we have Runescarred Demon, which is our demonic tutor on a stick. You notice that all of these things kind of work together synergistically in whether it's letting us pod up our power level, so we can pod a duplicate into a Runescarred Demon, we can pod a Green Warden into a Runescarred Demon, all that kind of stuff, and just let us get as many of the pieces of our combo as we can possibly get, because that is our primary win condition here, is getting our combo. And then finally, for our utility creatures, we have Deadeye Navigator. Deadeye Navigator pairs with all of our creatures super well, whether if it's pairing it with our Glenalandra to get rid of the -1/-1 on it, if it's pairing it with our duplicate to have a 2-mana exile spell, pairing it with our Massacre Worm to give our opponent's creatures -4 or -6 each turn, and then just do a ton of damage to them that way. Deadeye Navigator just works super well in this deck, giving us our removal, giving us more tokens, creatures, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, for our creatures, we have our clones. So for our clones, we have Phyrexian Metamorph, Phantasmal Image, and Clever Impersonator. These are the 3 best clones in the format, in my opinion. Clever Impersonator allows us to get our opponent's Planeswalkers, enchantments, artifacts, anything that we could want for 4 mana. So it's just a better clone than what we already have. Phyrexian Metamorph, it's a clone for 3 if we're paying 2 life with it. And it lets us get our opponent's Soul Ring, Birthing Pods, it lets us get our opponent's Chromatic Lanterns. And then finally we have Phantasmal Image, which is just a great clone for 2. It's going to get targeted a lot of the times, probably by an Inferno Titan or something of the like, but a lot of our opponent's creatures are going to do something as soon as they get onto the battlefield, because that's what Commander does. So we don't really care if it dies after that. Next we have our Planeswalkers. This deck's only playing 1 Planeswalker, it's playing 1 Jace the Mind Sculptor. Just pure fucking value town, baby. We can cascade into that on turn 5, and it is the best feeling in the world. So let's say we play our Yidris on turn 4, attack with it next turn, and then we play something like an Urban Evolution for 5, and then cascade right into a Jace the Mind Sculptor. Oh my god, that's the best feeling in the world. So yeah, we're playing 1 Jace in this deck, no other Planeswalkers. Now let's get into our instants and sorceries. So we have our removal and pseudo-removal in the form of Gaze of Granite, Chaos Warp, Crocyan Grip, Damnation, Cyclonic Rift, and Beast Within. So our sweepers are going to be Gaze of Granite, Damnation, and Cyclonic Rift. Those are going to let us deal with a ton of the threats on the board. And we're only playing 3 sweepers in this deck if you don't count Pernicious Deed in our enchantments. And that's because we have so many ways of getting cards back from our graveyard. So we're playing the Green Warden, we're playing Eternal Witness, and then we can pair those with Deadeye Navigator and just keep getting this stuff back. That's one of the things that you'll notice whenever you play this deck is if something goes to your graveyard, your opponents are still going to prioritize that because you have so many ways of just getting that right back that it's not really gone if you play it. So Damnation is just good with getting rid of creatures, that's what it does best. Gaze of Granite, a lot of people, this is the same thing as Green Warden, a lot of people overlook this card whenever they're deck building for Commander. I think it's one of the most versatile removal spells in the format. It lets you get rid of creatures, artifacts, enchantments, all that kind of stuff. And it costs a little bit, but whenever we're ramping as much as we are, it doesn't really matter for us. For our spot removal, we're playing Chaos Warp, Crocyan Grip, and Beast Within. Those all allow us to deal with many different threats on the board. Chaos Warp is a super versatile removal spell. Crocyan Grip and Beast Within are pretty self-explanatory. Now we move into our card draw and tutors. So this deck plays Harmonize, Dig Through Time, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Seasons Past, and Court of Calling. So our primary draw spells are in the form of Harmonize and Dig Through Time. If you played with Dig Through Time through Standard and whenever it was Modern Legal, you will know how good that card is. Being able to dig through 7 cards at the top of your library and pick 2 of them at the end of your opponent's turn for 2 mana is just unreal, especially whenever you're playing a deck that relies on its combos as much as we do. And Harmonize, it's just a draw spell. We're playing a lot of green lands in the deck. We're very green heavy, so we might as well play something like Harmonize, which is a little bit more powerful than something like Divination. For our tutors, we have Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Demonic Tutor, and I'm going to throw in Chord of Calling there as well because it lets us tutor for a creature. Even if Chord isn't the same as something like Worldly Tutor, in the same way that I'm grouping Vampiric Tutor and Mystical Tutor together, Chord lets us get something directly onto the battlefield and lets our creatures pay for it. So these primarily are in here to help us find our combos, and in some cases are utility creatures, just if we need something like an Acidic Slime or a Duplicant or something like that to deal with a threat that's on the board. But in a lot of cases we want to be a little bit more proactive in winning, so we're going to be finding things like our Splinter Twin, like our Kiki Jiki, all that kind of stuff that we can't otherwise find. In a lot of cases we want to find our Deceiver Exarch and our Pestermite, just so that we can cast them at the end of our opponent's turn and not tutor for them on our turn with something like a Birthing Pod. It lets us get those wins out of nowhere that we probably shouldn't have won. And then we have Seasons Past. Seasons Past is one of the most powerful cards in the format right now. It lets us get back an entire hand that we might have put into the graveyard, and that's why I keep saying things that are in your graveyard with this deck are kind of still in your hand, because you can get them back with so many different cards that we're playing. For our ramp, we play 3 cards, Farseek, Rampant Growth, and Urban Evolution. We're just trying to get more lands on the battlefield, trying to get our Yidris out as quickly as possible. And then finally, we're playing Counterspells. For our Counterspell suite, we're playing Counterspell, Mana Drain, and Force of Will. All of these are not to be used unless it's protecting your combo, or if somebody else is threatening to win. Kind of what this deck tries to do is it's trying to build its resources throughout the entire game and then have that explosive turn in the late game where it just wins. And your counter spells allow for you to do that. Now we have our enchantments. So this deck plays 4 enchantments: Survival of the Fittest, Sylvan Library, Pernicious Deed, and Rhystic Study. And also Splinter Twin, but we already covered that. Survival of the Fittest is probably one of the best tutors in the format right now. It allows us to discard a creature card from our hand for 1 green, and then find any creature card in our deck and put it on our hand. So that's awesome for finding more utility creatures, and that's another reason that we're playing all these utility creatures, is we can discard the ones that we're not using, that aren't relevant to the situation that we're in right now, and then find one that is through something like Survival of the Fittest. It's pretty pricey right now. Last I checked, it's like $150. But if you can find one that's a little bit more beat up, that your playgroup isn't going to really care if it's that beat up or not. I know Star City Games, if you go to GPs or if you go to Opens, they have a lot of these reserved list cards in heavily played condition. Then we have Sylvan Library, which is going to let us filter the top of our deck. It combos so well with Yidris in allowing us to stack whatever cards that we want to cascade into that turn on the top of our deck. Rhystic Study is very good in the early game. Still kind of good in the late game if your playgroup really plays a lot of big creatures, but in the early game is whenever Rhystic Study really shines. And then we have Pernicious Deed, which is just another board wipe that's a good threat on the board to have, and it needs to be dealt with by something that could be going towards something else, like your Survival of the Fittest or Rhystic Study. Now we're getting into the boring stuff, the artifacts and lands. So our mana rocks that we're playing are Soul Ring, Simic Signet, Dimir Signet, and Chromatic Lantern. All of these are just going to let us kind of filter our mana, get the colors we need for the late game, because like I keep saying, this deck is all about the mid game and the late game. Then for our utility artifacts, we're playing Lightning Greaves and Birthing Pod. So I do want to make a note here. A lot of these decks are playing Whisper Silk Cloak. In my opinion, it's a little bit slow, and haste is just too good on Yidris with Lightning Greaves. Can't be blocked is never really an issue, because the trample damage that Yidris has is just going to hit right through at least one player on your table. We get unblockable from our things like Thassa and Rogue's Passage whenever it's really needed, so I don't think that Whisper Silk Cloak is necessarily an auto-include in a Yidris deck here. Birthing Pod, I've been referencing it this entire video. Just so versatile in finding the creatures that we need and getting the threats on the board that are relevant to what's ever going on. Now for our lands. I'm just going to kind of run through these lands because they're the things in the deck that need the least explanation, and just trying to give you guys a baseline of what your mana base should look like for a deck that's playing 4 colors like this. And so we have our shock land suite. We have every single shock land for the colors that we're playing. We're playing Stomping Ground, Watery Grave, Breeding Pool, Steam Vents, Overgrown Tomb, and Blood Crypt. So for our fetches, we're playing Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs, Polluted Delta, Wooded Foothills, Scalding Tarn, and Bloodstained Mire. Now we're playing some buddy lands and check lands as well. Since we're playing so many shocks, it's always going to be out there. We're playing Drowned Catacomb, Hinterland Harbor, and Woodland Cemetery. We're not playing the full suite of buddy lands because the only colors that we really need in the early game that we need fast are blue, black, and green. We don't necessarily need any red in our early game. Those are just for our late game Inferno Titans, Kiki-Jikis, and Splinter Twins. For our filter lands, we're playing a Flooded Grove, Sunken Ruins, Twilight Mire, and Cascade Bluffs. We're playing 1 bounce land in the deck, a Simic Growth Chamber. We're playing 1 bounce land and not any more because bounce lands are really slow. And Simic Growth Chamber has the 2 colors that we run the most in this deck, green and blue. So we're not really going to need that kind of slow land with any of our other colors. We have our colorless and utility lands in the form of Temple of the False God, Ancient Tomb, Rogue's Passage, Beseiju, Reliquary Tower, Urborg, and Bojuka Bog. Now these lands kind of need a little bit of explanation. Temple of the False God and Ancient Tomb are just fantastic pieces of mana ramp. Rogue's Passage allows us to give Yidris unblockable and eliminates the need for something like Whisper Silk Cloak, like I said. Boseiju lets us cast our Gaze of Granites, our Damnations, Cyclonic Rifts, all that kind of stuff without the threat of it getting countered. Also, Seasons Past and Court of Calling, which are 2 super important cards in the deck. Reliquary Tower is awesome early game if you have that Rhystic Study out, because your opponents aren't going to be able to pay that mana. You just draw as many cards as you can, and you just keep them. You don't have to discard them or anything. Bojuka Bog is super good in black decks and EDH, just because it lets you deal with the graveyard deck on the table. And then Urborg, just fixing your colors. And now our multicolor cards. We are playing a Command Tower, a Reflecting Pool, Opulent Palace, Savage Lands, Frontier Bivouac, and Crumbling Necropolis. And now finally for our basics, we're playing 1 basic in each of our colors with the exception of Islands, which we play 2 of. I'm going to leave a link in the description to a tapped out page with this entire deck list on it that you guys can copy from, tinker with, and let us know in the comments down there what you guys think that we should change with the deck, because this is my primary commander deck that I play. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. We will be posting weekly with deck techs, live gameplay, and even some live streams here and there if we have the time. Make sure to turn on those post notifications to see whenever we have a new video coming out, and thanks for watching.